Good morning. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. I guess it's good morning here and wherever you are, good day, good evening, whatever. Welcome to today's webinar, The New Sanctions on Russia. They are a positive step, but to discuss this issue, we have three members of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network. And I suspect most of our viewers are familiar with each one of them, but a brief introduction nevertheless. Ed Chow is an international energy expert with over 45 years of industry experience. He's worked in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, South America, Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and throughout the Caspian and Black Sea regions. He's developed governmental policy, business strategies while advising governments, international financial institutions, major oil companies, and leading multinational corporations. Ed spent 20 years with Chevron Corporation in the U.S. and overseas, including as head of international external affairs and country manager in China. Ambassador Dan Fried. During his 40-year Foreign Service career, Dan played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. As Special Assistant and Senior Director for Presidents Clinton and Bush, Ambassador to Poland and Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, Ambassador Fried helped lead West's initial response to Moscow's 2014 invasion of Ukraine as State Department coordinator of sanctions policy. Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, served for 31 years as a Foreign Service officer at the Department of State, retiring with the rank of a career minister. He was U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006, when he worked to enhance U.S.-Ukraine relations, helped ensure the conduct of fair elections in the presidential races, and prevent violence during the Orange Revolution. Prior to that, he was ambassador to Uzbekistan, where he played a key role in the establishment of American base to help conduct the Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. There you have some brief bios of our discussions, but I will say, having known and worked with them for quite a number of years now, there are so many other interesting and positive things I'd love to share, but we need to get on to our subject. If you have questions during the course of this, there's a link below, and I emphasize I will try to get to them. Now to our topic. The new sanctions on Russia are a positive step, but we start with Ed. Ed, will Trump's Russian oil sanctions finally sway Putin?
Well, I guess we'll have to see. It's been 3.5 years since Russia's all-out assault on Ukraine, and the United States finally sanctioned directly Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, that together produces about half of Russia's oil. This is a significant step, and we should not underestimate its importance as a signal to Vladimir Putin. This is Mr. Trump's first action against Russia since he returned to the White House. Up to now, his strategy on Ukraine, or rather on Russia's war on Ukraine, seemed to be to accommodate Putin as much as possible in order to bring him to the negotiating table. If he stays the course, this would be a turnabout in which he will start pressuring Russia instead of Ukraine. A lot depends on sanctions enforcement, and Ambassador Fried is the expert there, and I'm sure he will have much to tell us. All I would say is that oil markets are skeptical. Oil price rose by about $6 a barrel last week, right after the announcement, and it's since fallen down by back down a couple of dollars. Russia exports more than 4 million barrels of crude oil and over 1 million barrels of refined products every day. If markets truly believe that these new sanctions will be enforced and dent Russian oil exports, say by half, it would rise, we would jump by over $20 a barrel, not a couple of dollars so far. So I think the markets are on a wait and see situation. This administration's record on enforcing sanctions against Russia has been spotty, to put it mildly. And I have examples of that if folks are interested during our discussion. The last thing I would say is that oil sanctions by themselves have rarely achieved foreign policy objectives. We saw that with sanctions against Iraq under Saddam Hussein, against Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, and America's sanctions today against Venezuela and Iran. Oil sanctions can be a useful tool, but only as part of an overall strategy. It is not a silver bullet. At the end of the day, there is simply no substitute for hard military power, especially in a war. Ukraine's attacks on Russian refineries and energy infrastructure are doing more damage to Russia's war-waging capacity than these new American sanctions can in the immediate term. This brings up the question of what else can this administration be doing besides strict sanctions enforcement to follow up on its new policy direction, if this is indeed a sustained policy direction. Certainly providing Ukraine with the necessary weapons to defeat Russia on the battlefield and seizing Russian frozen assets in the West for use by Ukraine should be considered. And I'm sure Ambassador Herbst will have more to say about this. In 2017, it was Mr. Trump who provided Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine to defend itself against Russia. Not the previous Obama administration. Let's hope we are in a similar turning point today.
Well, thanks, Ed. Dan, you've been, as has been mentioned, you've been deeply involved in designing and weighing sanctions. What do you think? Are these latest sanctions? How much can they do?
Well, I'm in basic agreement with Ed Chow. That is, I put it this way. The new sanctions are a good thing, full stop. It's the first time the Trump administration has actually crossed the line of additional new economic pressure on Russia. That said, they have to be enforced to work. Now, Ed's cautionary notes were right, so I'm not going to repeat them. But I will say that there are a couple of tests and signs. Remember, first, as a general principle, the sanctions won't be airtight. There will still be Russian oil flowing to markets. The question is, will that flow be reduced, and will Russia be able to sell its oil at, will there be a discount on the Russian oil that is sold? And I think the answer is probably yes. So the sanctions have the potential of taking money out of Putin's war machine, probably not as fast and completely as I and Ed and John would like, but they do have potential. But there are a couple of tests coming up. First, Yesterday, the U.S. issued a so-called comfort letter and then a general license to German-controlled subsidiaries of Rosneft. This is now publicly available. You can take a look at it. It gives them 6 months gives the Germans 6 months basically to clarify that the Russians really don't own these. And it's that kind of a license, if it is enforced, and if the Germans use the 6 months to get rid of Russian control and diversify the refineries with different products coming in, can be reasonable. But it can also be a loophole that the Germans could exploit, and the Russians could use various cutouts to keep selling oil to Germans and pretending they're not. So watch for the implementation of this. Secondly, Viktor Orban is coming to town next week. Viktor Orban has been hostile to Ukraine, cozying up to Putin and cozying up to MAGA world for many years. So far, Viktor Orban has not actually gotten a lot for his investment in MAGA world. Now it comes to the test. Orban is going to come here to try to get a sweetheart deal on Russian oil. Orban has rejected Trump's call for Europeans to stop buying Russian oil. He's made stupid excuses like Hungary is landlocked, therefore it has to import Russian oil. Well, Czechia is landlocked, and it's managed to diversify. So Orban's excuses are weak. And the question is, what deal will he walk away with? And the question is similar to the question about Germany. Will there be a wind down period that is seriously enforced? Will the Trump administration basically say to Orban, for all your ideological loyalty, we'll give you a few months, but you've got to ramp it down? Now, what I've implied is that a ramp down period for countries like Germany and Hungary can work. And let me be specific. Part of my conclusion that it can work is based on the experience of the Iran oil sanctions. There was, under Obama, a very difficult compromise. The Republicans in Congress back then were hawks. They pushed the Obama people to cut off Iranian exports of oil, and the Obama people did so, but with a caveat that if a country importing Iranian oil significantly reduced, that was the phrase, significantly reduced its oil purchases from Iran every 6 months, we'd give them a pass for another 6 months. Now, it actually worked. The Chinese and the Indians respected it, and they lowered their imports of Iranian oil significantly every 6 months. And the Iranian economy was sufficiently hurt that the Iranians agreed to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Now, you can argue that the Iran nuclear deal wasn't good enough, but you see what I'm driving at. A ramp down period can be effective. Russia's a bigger player in world oil markets than Iran by a lot, I think 3 times bigger. But I'm being kind of technical and specific, building on Ed Chow's model, because your audience should know what to look for. Look for what kind of a deal the Hungarians get next week. Look for the Germans acting or not acting within the 6 months license that the U.S. has offered. Now, for escalatory steps, oh man, I can think of a lot. Go after the shadow fleet, for God's sakes. The U.S. has been too cautious. The Biden people only did it after the last November's election because they didn't want to risk a spike in oil prices. Well, that was not a glorious position, but at least they did it. The Trump people now need to follow up and hit the Russian shadow fleet. We need to go after Indian and Chinese companies that evade the sanctions. So far, the Indians have said they're going to get out of the Russian market. The Chinese have said the same. And I know the Indians are thinking about asking for the same kind of ramp down period that the Germans have got. So are we going to push this? Will we enforce it? If so, it can work. And final thought, yeah, Ed's right. sanctions by themselves are not going to turn the tide, that they can be helpful if they're combined with other things. We have lots of headroom in additional sanctions. Let's use it. Anyway, over to John.
Hey, John, among your many responsibilities, you're chair of the FOUN's Task Force on National Security. What's your take on all this, and what else in overall policy is needed?
Okay. First, we've had a very bumpy ride on American policy towards Russia's aggression in Ukraine since Trump returned to the Oval Office. There are, I'd have to say, a majority of commentators on American national security policy in this area who think that Trump does not have an interest in thwarting Putin in Ukraine. Dan will speak for himself, but he and I have a similar view that for his own reasons, Trump is more likely to thwart Putin than to enable him. And there's a very active debate on this. And after the Zelensky meeting with Trump, which by one day followed the latest Putin phone call to Trump, a week and a half, actually close to 2 weeks ago, people who were skeptical about Trump, when Trump announced no Tomahawks for Ukraine, thought that this was further proof. But funny how things change overnight, because the sanctions that were put in place are very serious. As Ed and Dan described, there are some ambiguities there that need to be watched. Implementation is very important, but nonetheless, it is a serious step putting pressure on the Kremlin to end the war. So this means that Trump did another turnaround on his policy. And for the first time since returning to the Oval Office, he's made the Kremlin pay a price for its war on Ukraine. And while, yes, implementation, of course, is critical, and we're all waiting to see how this plays out, the Russians are nearly apoplectic about this. And it's not just the Russian media, which is always apoplectic, but officials have expressed concern. And Putin himself, while not criticizing Trump, that's a line he does not want to cross, has referred to this as hostile. And Putin has reverted to his favorite trick, which seemed to work with Biden, but so far has not worked with Trump. His trick of waiving his nuclear capacity. And they used to say back in Soviet times, it's no coincidence, comrade, that the latest Russian missile test and the latest Russian muscle flexing on nukes occurred after the sanctions were put in place this week. And to his credit, Trump not only ho-hummed it, instead of saying, oh my goodness, the Russians are threatening us with nukes, he also said, we have pretty good nukes ourselves, in fact, the best in the world, and we're going to resume nuclear testing because the Russians and the Chinese are doing that. So it's been a good week for American policy towards an aggressive Kremlin, starting with the with teeth sanctions, and then following that, not only the refusal to be intimidated by nuclear threats, but by taking a strong step back in Putin's direction, saying that we can play this game too, and we're bigger and we're stronger than you are, which of course we are. Now, I've just said too many positive things, so I have to add a nuance here. Trump took this step. Ed's right that this can't be a one-off. And Dan's right that, of course, implementation is key. If we really want Putin to negotiate a durable peace, the pressure we put on him has to go way up. It can't be a one-off, even a one-off with implementation. Putin needs to understand that the advantages we enjoy, both economic and military, are coming to haunt him if he continues this war. Uh, and I believe that the noun President Trump has used to describe the pressure he wants to put on on Russia, is calibration. Meaning, okay, we just did this. Let's see what goes on. And then maybe we need to come back with another step, but let's not overdo it. That's better than not taking the step at all. But that just makes it likely that Putin will drag out his aggression longer. Putin needs to understand that the world's greatest power is not buying his charm, is not buying his excuses, and will use its formidable assets to make it painful for the Russian economy and impossible for the Russian military to sustain this war. And that's where you come to other forms of pressure, including more advanced weapons.
Thank you, John. We have a question from somebody we all know, Richard Morningstar. Do you know if there's any truth to the reports that India and China are reducing their purchases from Lukoil in Moscow? Whoever can answer that.
Well, first of all, I think it's too early to tell. The sanctions did not come into force until November 21st. So there will be, cargoes that have been contracted and on the way. So we probably won't see numbers that reflect a reduction until a month or two from now. Certainly, the Indians have stated their concerns. Indian companies have. The major Chinese state oil companies have said that they are reconsidering or will be reducing their imports of Russian oil. But what you don't know is what else is going on with the other companies in China or in India, whether there are smaller companies that are not as engaged in the international market and therefore more vulnerable to American sanctions, who will ring fence themselves and continue to buy Russian oil. No, I think we'll have to see. I only had a chance this morning to look at English versions of the readout of the Xi Jinping Trump meeting today, Asia time. And there was definitely indication that they talked about Russia's war on Ukraine, and at least on the American side, saying that they will work together to try to end this war. I haven't had time to look at the Chinese reporting on this, but you would think that if they talked about the war, they might also have talked about other things related to the war, like Chinese exports of dual-use equipment to Russia and Chinese purchase of Russian oil and gas, even if it's not in the official readout. So I think it's too early to tell. We'll have to see. But is it having an impact on Chinese and Indian thinking? The answer is definitely yes.
Well, let me add something. Because I don't know anything. I'm just stating something that I heard at Forum 2000 in Prague 2 weeks ago. The issue of India's use or buying of Russian gas came up, and it appeared to me that the Indian respondent was very, very troubled by their dependence on Russia. But the point that she made was that India needs 5 million barrels of oil a day. And at one point, I'll have the numbers off, but I'm pretty close, they were only getting about 12% from Russia. And then we put sanctions on Venezuelan and Iranian oil, which was where they were getting most of their oil. Russia immediately came in with discounts and now is their major supplier, like 70%. They want to get away from that. but it's not an easy thing to do because of that huge need they have to keep their country running. I'm just reporting that. If there's response to that, it would be interesting to me at least. But our sanctions drew them away from their previous sources.
I suspect that the Indian government will find it far easier to work with work with Trump's new sanctions than they were with the tariffs. The tariffs were not really a practical instrument for getting India to get out of the Russian oil market because the tariffs are too tied up with trade issues. The sanctions are more discreet. India remembers perfectly well that they worked out a deal with the US government on the Iran oil sanctions, and they respected it. They respected it. They complained, so did the Chinese, but they did it. So this is a workable issue. The other variable, and Ed knows much more about this than I do, is the increase of U.S. export potential in oil and Saudi policy. So if the U.S. has an understanding with the Saudis, if Trump has managed to get put to work his relationship with the Crown Prince, then this actually could work. You might see less of a price spike and more opportunity for India and China to diversify. So this is all this is potentially workable depending on world supplies. And John and I and Ed are old enough to remember that the decline of the Soviet Union was spurred and accelerated by the decline in oil prices in the 1980s. Like, been there.
I would say the statistics you cited are generally accurate on India. But I think the argument the lady posed is a little disingenuous. I mean, they bought the Russian oil because it was cheaper. It was good business, not because they can't find oil somewhere else, sloshing around. No, you need 5 million barrels per day, but it's 100 million barrels per day market out there. So they could have found the oil. It was just good business to buy it from Russia instead. I agree with Dan that the tariffs against India on buying Russian oil hurts the buyer, doesn't hurt the seller. And what these sanctions do is that at a minimum, they would deepen the discount Russia has to offer in order to move their oil. And that hurts the seller, not the buyer of the oil. Dan mentioned Viktor Orban's visit. Because I look at the global oil market, I think he's right that Mohammed bin Salman is also coming next week to Washington. And what comes out of that discussion on the future of the oil markets, which is already oversupplied, by the way, that's the general estimation, because of rise in OPEC production. What the Saudis will do, and there will always be a cost associated, of course, with what they may be willing to do, would be interesting to see after the Crown Prince's visit next week.
A footnote to what Ed said. The reason the Indians found it good business to buy Russian oil was because under the price cap, they were getting it at a discount. The people go hot and cold on the price cap, but the idea was you incentivize the Indians to respect it because it's in their financial interest. They get a discount on imported oil. So to complain that the Indians were doing what the U.S. had intended for them to do, that is buy cheaper Russian oil, taking money out of Putin's pocket, is silly. We want to change policy? Great. I'm in favor of the new sanctions, but let's not beat up on the Indians. Let's remember that they were doing exactly what we wanted them to do, and we encouraged them to do. buy cheaper Russian oil rather than expensive Russian oil. Now the time has come to ramp up the pressure against Russia, take more money out of their pocket. And that's the bottom line. It's not the amount of oil that Russia sells. It's the revenue they gain from selling that oil. And as Ed mentioned, and I want to foot stomp, if the results of the sanctions mean that Russia sells oil at an even greater discount because of the extra risk involved, that's not bad either. The sanctions don't have to work perfectly to be effective. The more money they take out of Putin's war machine, the better.
John, well, I ask everybody. We're talking about oil, we're talking about sanctions, but at the same time, again, I'm not an expert. I just read what is coming in. The Ukrainians are doing a lot of damage to oil refineries and transportation within Russia. It would seem to be that the sanctions and Ukraine's actions are multiplying the impact on Russia's ability to, as you say, Dan, get money to run its war machine. Am I giving too much credit to what I'm reading about the Ukrainians' attacks on oil refineries and so forth?
No, the Ukrainian strikes are very, very effective. And there's not quite precise information about the extent of the damage, but the range is they've taken out from 20 to even 30 or 38% of Russia's hydrocarbon producing refining capability. That's a very large number. Even a lower number, 20% is a large number. So there's no question this has increased the financial pressure on the Russian economy, which is not doing very well. And to the embarrassment of the Putin regime, it's created huge, huge lines for motorists at gas stations across the length and breadth of the Soviet Union, including at least in the Leningrad Oblast, if not in St. Petersburg itself. So this has been arguably maybe the strongest sanction put down by anyone on Moscow's war. It's not ultimately decisive, but it is certainly undermining both the economy and the military effort. And of course, Ukrainian drone strikes are not limited to hydrocarbon installations. They've been taking out important transportation nodes and trains loaded with, well, for that matter, oil, but also weapons.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that what Ukraine is doing, and doing in large part on its own creativity, is making a difference. But then we do go back to the question, not specifically under our topic, but what about the support, weapons support from the United States and the West, John?
Unfortunately, the Trump team came into office with the notion that they should stop providing aid to Ukraine, and therefore we're not. I think that's a mistake because the Ukraine's survival as a nation, and Putin's aim is actually to make sure Ukraine does not survive as an independent nation. Ukraine's survival as a nation is, as Trump said last year, important to the United States, especially since Putin's malign objectives go beyond Ukraine. He wants to seriously weaken transatlantic relations. He wants to seriously weaken NATO and the EU. And of course, we know that a large majority of Americans, 69%, believe we should be giving at least as much aid to Ukraine as we gave to, as Biden gave to Ukraine. Okay, but I didn't specifically answer your question, so I'll do that now. The good news is that Trump does not seem as timid as Biden at providing weapons to Ukraine. Trump's own plan for establishing a durable peace includes arming Ukraine to the hilt. And while Trump is not willing to provide American weapons as gifts to Ukraine, he's willing to open our supply supplies to purchases, whether by the Europeans on behalf of Ukraine or by the Ukrainians. And very importantly, we know how important for Trump, and for that matter, for the United States, access to Ukrainian critical and rare earth minerals is. And Trump has said that the joint foundation that we've created with the Europeans to oversee development, U.S. Ukrainian development of rare earths, critical minerals, and for that matter, other Ukrainian natural resources, can include American weapons as a contribution to the fund. So that means that our stake in that foundation, overseeing critical minerals and other natural resources, goes up if we send weapons to Ukraine. So this means that Ukrainian purchases of advanced American weapons is contingent not just on the amount of money Europe is willing to spend and the Ukraine may have, and Ukraine's economy is obviously sorely pressed by this war, but also they can get weapons by increasing the American stock, the American equity in that fund. And that's a great thing.
Yeah, yeah. That, you talk about that, and it all sounds like things are coming in place. There are these movements to try and weaken various European countries' resolve, but I don't know. I watch them. You are more in touch with those countries and what's going on than I am, but it seems like right now it's holding in support of Ukraine, and maybe even growing in most of the countries. No, go ahead.
Okay. I'll certainly take a shot at that, but I think Dan may want to jump in as well. The Europeans have impressed me since the dreadful Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and Trump on February 28th by energetically addressing the issue of Ukraine's security and their own security in connection with Ukraine. In other words, they understand if Putin wins in Ukraine, takes effective political control of Ukraine, he's coming for other countries in Europe. So the smart move is to stop Putin in the largest country wholly within Europe geographically, with the still largest population that is fighting for its life as Ukrainians. And we've seen this, one in Europe willing to fill in at least some of the vacuum created by the end to American assistance to Ukraine. We've seen this in European forwardness in planning for deployment of forces in some fashion to Ukraine, which of course it was originally a Trump idea, and that has increased their influence with President Trump and his team. The Europeans have entered energetically into a dialogue with the United States and Ukraine on security guarantees, a very difficult subject, of which, of course, European deployment to Ukraine would be part of. And this is a most un-European-like expression of geopolitical wisdom and independence in addressing their own security needs. Now, all of these things, the conversation about security guarantees is slow. It's partly bogged down. The European plans for some form of presence in Europe in Ukraine is moving slowly, but it's all still moving. And the fact that the Europeans are doing this is one reason why Trump is heading in the right direction in dealing with Kremlin aggression and not the wrong one. Plus, also very important, the European leadership has been brilliant. And to mention the most prominent names, I'll probably forget someone who's important to this, but Macron, Starmer, Merz, then the number of European leaders who have special relationship with Trump. Maloney, Stu, the new Polish president, and of course Rutte, who has a great relationship with Trump, right? The NATO Secretary General. They've all been overtly active. I shouldn't say overly, necessarily extremely active, staying in touch with Donald Trump. So the Alaska summit with Trump and Putin was not a point of glory in American diplomatic history, but it did not become a true problem because 3 days later, 7 European leaders descended on the White House for a truly extraordinary summit. And that process continues to this day.
So I agree with what John said. In addition, the Europeans are responding to Putin's aggression. His arrogance can prove his downfall. In Germany, you still have AfD. They're pro-Russian, hard right, aligned with Putin. It's very odd. But the German foreign policy, the German center, has now crystallized with alarm about Russian aggression in a way that I didn't think possible. The head of the German intelligence service has testified to the Bundestag about Russian aggression against Germany. This would have never happened 10 years ago. So the shift in German thinking is real, and they have realized that the Balts and the Poles and the Finns were right about Russia and they were wrong. That is a very big deal. The second piece of good news is that Maloney combines a right-wing cultural profile, which she holds. I mean, this is part of her identity, with a strong pro-free world, pro-Ukraine, anti-Putin foreign policy. Excellent to have somebody like that on the right able to work with MAGA world. And the Polish president Nawrocki had a good initial meeting with Trump, and he will be able to argue the case for continued American support and vigilance. So all of this suggests that Putin has, as the Russians are wont to do, badly overplayed his hand and run out ahead of his political potential. And it could hurt him. Now, this isn't quite the topic of our discussion, but Putin is thinking rationally within his rotten frame of reference by hoping for some dirty deal with Trump and some political collapse in Germany if AfD takes power, or some behind-the-scenes deal to get Le Pen to go in the AfD direction instead of the Maloney direction. So the odds of this happening are not zero. So Putin, understandably, is playing out this string. If he fails, he may reconsider. And if we manage to put more pressure on Russia, we, the US, plus the Europeans, keep their act together and keep doing what they need to do to support European security, this could end up decently. But Putin is counting on European weakness and a bad deal with the Americans, and maybe good news on the battlefield, because things at Pokrovsk are not good right now. So Putin will use that to argue that he's inevitably winning, and Trump should flip back to sympathize with Putin's aims. So the game's afoot, but there's been some good developments if we keep playing them.
Well, you just brought up something that I've been noticing recently, that Russia is saying and talking about all its gains in Ukraine, whereas I'm hearing from other sources, not just Ukrainian, that they're not making much in the way of gains at all, but they're advertising to their people that things are going well. And it seems to me that, well, I'm asking, that things aren't going so well, and in the war, as well as whether the economy, it seems to me that those are acts of of a government that's trying to reassure its population while it's trying to figure out how to get some positive results on its own. I mean, whether it's from the Institute of the Study of War or other places, it doesn't seem that what Russia is saying is happening on the battlefield is actually happening.
Is that for me, for Dan?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, I think that your characterization right now is correct. There have been reports which Dan referred to about some Russian gains in Pokrovsk, and those reports are legitimate, although there are also now reports coming in part from Russian telegram channels saying that Gerasimov, in public meetings with Putin on national TV, Russian TV, has maps showing Russian forces 5, 10, 15, 20 kilometers west of where their forces actually are on the battlefield.
Mm.
In other words, precisely the point you just made. And it is true that what the information I'm about to give you is maybe 3 weeks old, but it was very good information suggesting that at that point, Ukraine in recent counteroffensives, partly then around Pokrovsk, but not just, also Kupiansk, had taken back another 360 square kilometers of territory. Bottom line, there are still spots where the Russians are inching forward. There are spots where they have been pushed back, and they have not made overwhelming progress. They've made minor progress at great cost. That's still I think, the best quick summary of what they've done on the battlefield. And again, there are enough voices in not the official Russian media, but amongst Russian nationalists and chauvinists, in other words, those who are all in for a war on Ukraine, that say the Russian performance has been dismal, and the credit that Gerasimov is trying to take for the offensive of the past year, which has been described in the Western media as almost inevitable gains, that those claims are greatly overblown. And I think that's true. But again, there could be a breakthrough, and people were concerned. There were real good reports in recent days about Pokrovsk along the lines that Dan was outlining earlier.
Well, this is off our direct subject, but something I keep always bringing up. Brutal treatment of prisoners of war and the abductions of children continue to go on. And I keep finding out that the American population, the more they find out about that, the more they're on the side of the Ukrainians. The abductions and when Ukraine takes back some territory that has been occupied, they find torture chambers, including, as General Breedlove always points out, torture chambers designed for children. The bottom line, the world is seeing evil right in front of its face. I mean, it's genuine evil that's driving this war. And I'm hoping that all the things we're talking about with the positive reactions starting in Europe and so forth, and in the Trump administration, that we finally start giving Ukraine what it needs to win this war and drive the Russians off its territory. War crimes just continue to pile up. There's an article, the editorial in the Wall Street Journal today, pointing out that China is significantly supporting Russia's war effort in a number of different ways, and it doesn't really focus on the purchase of oil. But have any of you seen that? It seems to me that we talked a little bit about the meeting that took place today in China, but and we don't know. Ed, you were talking about you'd read English, but you haven't been able to do your wonders of reading what the Chinese are saying about it. But they seem to be providing plenty of war materials that are necessary to keep this war effort. And there's another article I saw this morning that there are companies in Hong Kong that are facilitating the end runs around sanctions. Ed, do you have anything on that?
Well, as Dan know better than me, enforcing sanctions is like whack-a-mole, right? I mean, every time you close down the shop, a new one opens. And it's not just Hong Kong, Singapore, it's Dubai, it's a lot of other places as well. But Bob, I want to react to something that you just said about the brutality of Russia's war against Ukraine, and somewhat related to our original topic, and which makes all sanctions challenging. The West has leverage on the global economy, but the West is not where oil demand growth is. It is the developing world where that have increasing demands for energy. We quite reasonably framed this war as being Russia attacking not only Ukraine, but the West. This is, first of all, true, but also helps us garner domestic political support. However, it is equally true that this is a colonial war of conquest and plunder, which is a framing that would resonate more with the global South than saying this is a war against the West. How to engage other countries in these separate but accurate narratives are what smart diplomats and like Ambassador Fried and Herbst do. And we need to work on that a lot more if we want to get the support of countries like not only China and India, but the rest of the developing world as well. And that's where the action on the oil markets are going to be in the future.
Dan, you have a comment?
Well, Ed's right that framing the war for the global South is important. And I'd say that India and Brazil are probably, they may be to some degree receptive to those arguments, but the US agenda with them is dominated by tariffs, trade with India, and a probably unnecessary fight with Brazil over politics and a policy driven by partisanship on the US side. So the Trump administration on Ukraine has put out a policy that could succeed, but it is not skillful or has not shown much skill so far at coordinating the different strands of its policy. All administrations consist of competing groups. This administration has those groups a little more so than others, and it has the mechanisms to coordinate these views and smooth them over a little weaker than most administrations. So you have a problem with the administration not being able to consistently advance its own policies because they get in the way of each other. That's a problem sort of generally with the Trump administration, even though on Ukraine, I am in agreement with John that the general trend line for all the zigzags has been better. We are better off than we were in January, much better than we were on February 28th, the Oval Office blow-up. But if we want to help Ukraine succeed, which is in our American interest, we need to mean it. And we need to incorporate that, maybe not as the dispositive issue in our relations with all countries, but a significant issue, especially with India and Brazil. And I think we can do that, but it is, under the Trump administration, consistency and steadiness are often commodities in relatively short supply. Even though I basically think the Trump administration has, a case for its Ukraine policy. It could succeed and they could be vindicated, and I wish them success.
I want to insert one thing because you brought up and talk about quote unquote the global South. At the Forum 2000, one of the things that interested me, representatives from all over Africa, most of whom I sensed, favor Ukraine, favor the U.S. supporting Ukraine and so forth, kept saying that the narrative in Africa for years is totally dominated by Russian propaganda. And there, Russia does not talk about a war with Ukraine. It talks about a war with NATO and the United States that's taking place in Ukraine. An interesting twist, and it changes how many people in Africa perceive what's going on. I just thought I'd add that because I found that interesting and something I wasn't aware of. Oh, wait a minute. We have another question here. Going back to the role of EU in supporting Ukraine, how serious are the obstacles presented by Hungary and Slovakia? John?
Uh, the problems are real, but not overwhelming. Slovakia and perhaps even more Hungary receive a great deal of benefits from being part of the EU. And the pattern has been, and this pattern, predates the Russian big invasion. The Europeans put serious sanctions on Russia in the late summer of 2014 after the shoot down of the aircraft with over 100 Malaysian aircraft with over 100 Dutch citizens on, maybe 300 citizens overall. And Orban has tried to block sanctions from time to time ever since. But the pattern has also been when especially Germany and France speak with one harsh voice to such games, Orban backs down. So we've seen variations of that literally now for over a decade. And I think it's still manageable in that way. And of course, the emergence of Fico, who Dan knows from his days as a diplomat, has made it a little bit harder because now Orban has a junior partner in crime, but also a little bit harder, not substantially harder, because the same dynamic plays.
You got a thumbs up from Dan. We're closing in our hour, so why don't we do a final round in the same order that we began? Any final comments that you want to make? Ed?
I would just emphasize again the need to stay the course if this is going to be a permanent cause, and start signaling and acting on, if the Russians don't respond in the proper way, on additional pressure on Russia, whatever those may be that the administration is considering. This cannot be a one-off. It really needs to be sustained to get the right kind of response from the Russian side. The other thing, as long as we're talking about countries, I would flag is let's see what kind of conversation Erdogan and Trump are going to have on Turkey's purchase of Russian oil. Turkey is the third largest purchaser of Russian oil behind China and India. And of course, Turkey is a NATO ally. So what happens there will signal to the rest of the world, I think, how serious the Trump administration is with this set of sanctions.
Dan?
The Trump administration has its own logic, which may overlap, but is probably not the same as the logic of most people listening in. They could nevertheless end up doing the right thing. And the argument to make to the Trump administration is, this is a winnable issue for the president, but then you have to mean it. You have to go after the Russians, keep the pressure on, and emerge the winner and vindicated. That is possible. And if President Trump can do it, all credit to him.
John?
Sort of to join Dan and Ed's remarks, President Trump can do it. And in order to do it, we're talking about 6 minimum, 8, 10, 15 months of constant ratcheting up of pressure. So that Putin understands he cannot charm Trump out of this policy. As the Russian economy, which again is stuttering, moves closer and closer to collapse, as Russian troops on the battlefield, instead of making gains of 5 or 10 yards a day, and finds itself being pushed back some because of American weapons, Putin will realize he has no chance to take control of Ukraine, and he's only endangering his own regime. That's what we need to make clear. If we do that, Trump can achieve a truly extraordinary but easily foreseeable victory.
Well, thank you. As I commented, I think a couple of times, most of you, certainly John and Dan, travel much more to Europe than I have. I haven't, until I went to the conference in Prague, I haven't been there in a number of years. But I wear this little flag, American and Ukrainian flag. At the airport in Prague, there were people with lapel pins with the Czech flag and the Ukrainian flag. In Frankfurt, there were lapel pins with the German flag and the Ukrainian flag. I found that something that was very nice to see. And I hope it's reflective of those populations. It certainly was nice to see in the airports. I thank you guys. It's always good to be with you. I know we'll be in touch in other ways over probably the day and weeks ahead, but I appreciate you and thank everybody for listening. We'll see you all much later. Thank you.
Bye.